I'll pay you double if you have a balance. The manager's laughter echoed through the bank lobby, unaware that the shabby-looking man before him was actually the CEO of the entire banking corporation. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The morning sun streamed through the wide glass windows of the bank, casting golden rays across the polished marble floors. The light bounced off the brass fixtures and illuminated dust particles dancing in the air, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the tension filling the space. It was 9:30, peak hour at the financial institution, and the lobby hummed with the controlled chaos of the daily rush. Men and women, in crisp business attire, formed impatient queues, their polished shoes tapping rhythmically against the floor. A woman in a charcoal pantsuit checked her watch for the third time in as many minutes, sighing loudly enough for those nearby to hear her frustration. Next to her, a middle-aged man in a navy blazer scrolled through his smartphone, occasionally glancing up at the digital number display above the teller windows. "Number 47, called out a teller, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of shuffling papers, hushed conversations, and the soft chime of the entrance door announcing new arrivals. The bank's atmosphere was thick with importance and hurry. Briefcases clutched tightly, documents organized in leather portfolios, and faces set in expressions of determination. Everyone had somewhere more important to be, something more crucial to do than wait in this line. A young executive repeatedly checked his device while balancing a coffee cup, multitasking even in this moment of forced pause. By the velvet ropes that guided the queue, two financial advisors in matching gray suits conversed in low tones, occasionally nodding toward the private consultation rooms where wealthier clients were escorted. Their laughter seemed out of place in the otherwise serious environment. Near the entrance, a security guard stood at attention, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd, nodding politely to regular customers he recognized. The morning light highlighted the brass nameplate on his uniform as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The wall clock ticked methodically above the loan department, drawing anxious glances from those who had scheduled their bank visit during what they had hoped would be a quick break from work. A woman in a cream-colored blouse fanned herself with an envelope, the heating system working overtime against the morning chill outside. "I have a meeting in 15 minutes, whispered one man to his colleague, adjusting his silk tie with nervous fingers. "I thought I'd be in and out." The bank staff moved with practiced efficiency behind their counters, though it never seemed quite fast enough for the waiting customers. Each face in the crowd told a similar story, of schedules disrupted, of minutes ticking by too quickly, of the modern urgency that made waiting feel like a personal affront. No one noticed the entrance door opening once more, admitting a tall, elderly figure who would soon change the rhythm of this ordinary morning in ways none of them could anticipate. The glass doors of the bank swung open, and a figure stepped inside who seemed to belong to an entirely different world than the polished marble floors and sleek counters. Amidst the sea of tailored suits and designer handbags, Mr. Harlan entered with unhurried steps, his presence immediately drawing curious glances from those waiting in line. He stood tall despite his years, his weathered face telling stories of decades under open skies. A gray beard, neatly trimmed but not stylish, framed features that had been carved by time and experience, rather than cosmetic procedures. His faded checkered shirt hung loosely over his frame, its collar slightly frayed from countless washes, while his worn jeans bore the honest marks of physical labor. Not the fashionable, pre-distressed kind that cost hundreds, but genuine wear from actual work. The elderly man adjusted the straw hat that shaded his eyes, a practical accessory rather than a fashion statement. His hands, large and calloused, spoke of a lifetime of craftsmanship and toil, each line and scar a testament to honest work. As he moved deeper into the lobby, The contrast between him and the other customers grew more pronounced. Several patrons shifted uncomfortably in their expensive attire, some even taking a small step back, as if his workman's appearance might somehow contaminate their carefully curated images. A young woman in a crisp business suit glanced at her companion, eyebrows raised in silent judgment. The security guard near the entrance straightened slightly, watching the newcomer with unnecessary attention. If Mr. Harlan noticed these reactions, he gave no indication. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly who he is and feels no need to explain himself to others. His eyes, sharp and clear despite his age, took in the opulent surroundings without being impressed or intimidated. As he approached the waiting area, a businessman in an expensive suit deliberately placed his leather briefcase on the empty seat beside him, avoiding eye contact. The elderly visitor simply nodded politely and found a spot to stand, leaning slightly on one leg, as if accustomed to long periods of standing. What none of the onlookers could possibly know was that those worn hands had signed documents worth millions, that behind those patient eyes lay the mind that had built this very institution from nothing. The straw hat concealed the head that made decisions affecting everyone in the room. For now, though, he was content to wait his turn, just another customer in need of service, invisible in his ordinariness among those who valued only what gleamed on the surface. Mr. Harlan shuffled forward, each step measured and deliberate. His calloused hands clutched an old leather wallet, worn at the edges from years of use, the leather cracked and faded like his own weathered skin. The morning crowd parted slightly as he moved through the lobby, not out of respect, but from an unspoken desire to maintain distance. Curious glances turned into lingering stares. A woman in a tailored business suit clutched her designer handbag closer to her body as the elderly man passed by. Two investment bankers paused their conversation, exchanging knowing looks that spoke volumes without a single word uttered. The wealthy clientele, adorned in their pristine suits and polished shoes, regarded him with expressions that cycled between pity and undisguised disdain. "Probably lost," whispered a man to his companion, not bothering to lower his voice enough. "The Social Security office is 3 blocks down." The elderly gentleman kept his eyes forward, his dignity intact despite the weight of judgment pressing down upon him. His faded checkered shirt hung loosely on his tall frame, a stark contrast to the crisp fabric surrounding him. The torn jeans he wore had earned their phrase honestly, through labor, rather than through a designer's calculated distressing. Even the staff behind their polished counters seemed uncomfortable with his presence. A young teller glanced up, then quickly averted her eyes when she caught sight of him. Another employee straightened papers that were already perfectly aligned, suddenly finding the task absolutely necessary. The security guard shifted his position, watching the old man with a wary eye, as if his shabby appearance might somehow threaten the bank's pristine atmosphere. Mr. Harlan noticed it all, but betrayed nothing. Decades of being underestimated had taught him patience. His gray beard concealed the slight tightening of his jaw, the only outward sign of his awareness of their judgment. He adjusted his straw hat slightly, a small gesture of self-assurance in a sea of silent rejection. A businessman checked his expensive watch and sighed dramatically as the elderly man approached the queue, clearly assuming this interaction would delay everyone's morning. The bank's marble floors reflected the scene like a mirror, wealth and presumption on one side, perceived poverty on the other. What none of them could see was the quiet strength in his eyes, or the slight smile that occasionally flickered across his face. They couldn't know that those calloused hands had built more than they would ever understand. The wallet he held contained more than just an identification card. It held the truth that would soon turn their judgment to shock. Mr. Harlan clutched his old leather wallet tightly as he shuffled toward the counter. the weight of judgmental stares pressing upon his shoulders like an invisible burden. Despite the discomfort, his purpose remained clear and simple. He merely needed to check his account balance, ensuring his financial affairs were in proper order before the month's end. The elderly man had never been one for ostentation. Throughout his 78 years of life, he had worked diligently, saved prudently, and invested wisely, all without ever feeling the need to broadcast his success. His weathered hands told the story of decades of labor, from his humble beginnings as a farmhand to the quiet acquisition of businesses that eventually led to his ownership of this very bank. "Excuse me," he said softly to the teller, his voice carrying the gentle confidence of someone who knows their worth isn't measured by others' perceptions. "I'd like to check my account balance, please." The young woman behind the counter barely concealed her impatience, glancing past him to the well-dressed customers waiting in line. Her expression suggested she was calculating how quickly she could dispatch with this seemingly unimportant client. Mr. Harlan noticed her reaction but showed no sign of offense. He was accustomed to being underestimated. Throughout his career, this very tendency of people to judge by appearances had often worked to his advantage in business negotiations. "Do you have your identification with you, sir?" the teller asked, her tone carrying a hint of doubt, as if questioning whether someone dressed so modestly would even have proper documentation. He nodded, carefully extracting his ID from the wallet. The leather was cracked with age, but meticulously maintained, much like the man himself. As he waited, he observed the bustling lobby, taking in the hurried movements of people whose worth seemed tied to their external presentation. A lifetime of working quietly had taught Mr. Harlan the value of observation. While others rushed to speak, to be seen, to impress, he had learned that true power often resided in patience and restraint. His substantial wealth had accumulated not through flashy ventures, but through consistent, thoughtful decisions made without fanfare. The teller took his identification with visible reluctance, her manicured fingernails a stark contrast to his calloused hands. Little did she know that the unassuming figure before her could purchase her annual salary with what amounted to pocket change in his accounts. Mr. Harlan stood patiently, his posture revealing nothing of his true status. In a world where people were quick to flaunt even the smallest achievements, his greatest accomplishment remained his ability to walk through life without needing others' validation. The bank owner waited, invisible in plain sight, a silent lesson in humility that no one around him was yet prepared to learn. The glass door of the office near the back of the bank swung open with practiced precision. Victor Morrow emerged, adjusting his silk-red tie against the crisp white collar of his shirt. The branch manager moved with the confident stride of someone who believed the floor should feel honored to support his weight. His dark blue suit, tailored to perfection, caught the morning light as he surveyed his domain with a satisfied expression. Victor was 32, but had the ambition of someone twice his age. He'd climbed the corporate ladder with remarkable speed, not always through merit, but often through carefully cultivated relationships with the right people. The young executive had mastered the art of appearing busy and important, frequently checking his smartphone even when no notifications demanded his attention. His eyes scanned the lobby, mentally categorizing each customer by their apparent worth. The woman in the designer blazer, potential investment opportunity. The businessman with the leather portfolio, already a premium account holder. Victor's gaze lingered appreciatively on these clients, offering them practiced smiles that never quite reached his eyes. Then his attention fell on Mr. Harlan. The branch manager's expression shifted subtly, his lips thinning with barely concealed disdain. To Victor, appearance was everything, and the elderly man in worn clothing represented everything he had worked to distance himself from. The manager had grown up in modest circumstances, but had spent years erasing any trace of that past, replacing it with designer labels and affected mannerisms. He straightened his already impeccable posture and made his way across the marble floor, nodding to select customers. The staff watched his movement with a mixture of respect and wariness. Victor demanded perfection from his employees but rarely acknowledged their efforts, creating an atmosphere of constant tension beneath the bank's polished surface. As he approached the main counter, several tellers straightened their postures instinctively. The young manager had a reputation for publicly criticizing staff members who failed to meet his exacting standards. His leadership style relied heavily on intimidation rather than inspiration. Victor paused at the counter, glancing at the waiting line where Mr. Harlan stood patiently. Something about the old man's quiet dignity irritated him, a quality the manager couldn't quite identify but instinctively resented. Perhaps it was the way the elderly gentleman seemed unbothered by the judgmental glances, or how he carried himself with a confidence that required no external validation. The branch manager drummed his manicured fingers on the counter's polished surface, his gold watch glinting under the recessed lighting. In Victor's carefully constructed world, worth was measured by appearance, and by that metric, the old man in the straw hat had no place in his bank. Victor Morrow had been watching the bank floor from his glass office, observing the morning's clientele with calculated interest. His attention snagged on the elderly man in the faded checkered shirt and torn jeans. The branch manager's lips curled slightly as he straightened his red tie and emerged onto the main floor, his polished shoes clicking against the marble. Mr. Harlan stood patiently in line, seemingly oblivious to the stares his weathered appearance attracted among the well-dressed customers. Victor approached the counter where his colleague, Emma, was processing transactions. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Look at that scarecrow waiting in line," he murmured, nodding subtly toward the elderly man. "Probably wants to know if his Social Security check cleared." Emma stifled a laugh, her eyes darting toward the old man before returning to Victor. The manager's confidence grew with her reaction, feeding his sense of superiority. "I bet he's just here to get warm," Victor continued, his whisper just loud enough for nearby customers to overhear. A few of them glanced up from their smartphones, some smirking in agreement. The branch manager straightened up, adjusting his cuffs with practiced precision. Something about the old man's quiet dignity irritated him, perhaps because it seemed so at odds with his shabby appearance. Victor had built his career on appearances, on the belief that worth was visible in one's attire and manner. He cleared his throat, deliberately raising his voice to carry across the lobby. "If you even have a balance, old man, I'll pay you double." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Several customers looked up, some with uncomfortable expressions, others with thinly veiled amusement. A young woman in a business suit shifted awkwardly, averting her eyes from the scene. The elderly visitor paused, his weathered hand still clutching his leather wallet. For a moment, he seemed to consider responding, but instead, he simply lowered his gaze to the floor. Victor's smile widened at what he perceived as victory. He turned to the gathered customers, as if inviting them to share in his joke, his posture radiating the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught his expensive watch as he gestured dismissively toward Mr. Harlan. "Some people really don't understand that this is a financial institution, not a charity," he added loudly, drawing another nervous laugh from Emma and a few customers. What Victor didn't notice was the slight straightening of Mr. Harlan's shoulders, or the quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from the elderly man despite the public humiliation. The manager simply turned away, satisfied with his display of wit, completely unaware of the storm he had just unleashed. Victor Morrow's cruel jab echoed through the marble lobby, bouncing off the polished surfaces like a stone skipping across still water. The hushed conversations that had filled the space moments before died instantly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that seemed to thicken the air. Every head turned toward the elderly man in the faded checkered shirt, their expressions ranging from embarrassment to morbid curiosity. Mr. Harlan stood perfectly still, his weathered hands still clutching his old leather wallet. He lowered his gaze to the floor, not in shame, but in a quiet dignity that spoke volumes. The straw hat he wore cast a shadow across his features, hiding the momentary flash of pain that crossed his face. He had endured far worse in his long life than the mockery of a young man who measured worth by appearances. Around him, the other customers shifted uncomfortably. A woman in a tailored business suit pretended to check her smartphone, unable to look directly at the scene unfolding before her. A young father pulled his curious child closer, whispering something about respect. Even some of the bank staff behind their counters looked away, their professional smiles faltering as they witnessed their manager's cruelty. The branch manager stood tall, his dark blue suit immaculate, a smirk still playing at the corners of his mouth as he waited for some reaction from the old man. The silence stretched between them, growing heavier with each passing second. Victor's smirk began to fade slightly when he realized his target wouldn't provide the entertainment he'd expected. "Sir?" called a hesitant voice from one of the counters, breaking the tension. "You can come forward now." Mr. Harlan nodded almost imperceptibly, his dignity intact despite the public humiliation. He moved forward with unhurried steps, the sound of his worn boots against the marble floor the only noise in the still silent bank. The elderly man never raised his voice, never defended himself, never showed anger at the treatment he'd received. Instead, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his own worth wasn't determined by others' perceptions. As he approached the counter, a few customers exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the uncomfortable scene they had just witnessed. The weight of Victor's words hung in the air like an invisible cloud, following Mr. Harlan as he prepared to conduct his simple business. What none of them realized was how dramatically the scales would soon tip, transforming this moment of humiliation into something entirely different. What none of the bank patrons or employees realized as they watched the unfolding scene was that Mr. Harlan was far from the penniless old man they had assumed. Behind the weathered face and calloused hands was the brilliant mind that had built the very institution they stood in from nothing more than determination and vision. 40 years earlier, Thomas Harlan had started with a small loan and an unwavering belief that banking should serve people of all backgrounds with dignity. Through decades of careful investment and ethical business practices, he had transformed a single branch into a respected financial institution with locations across the region. Yet, despite his immense success, the elderly man had never sought the spotlight, preferring to operate in the background and let his work speak for itself. As founder and silent CEO, he maintained a simple office in the corporate headquarters, rarely visiting the branches except for his periodic, unannounced inspections. These visits were his way of ensuring that the principles upon which he had built his business remained intact. Today was one such inspection, though none of the staff had been informed. The humble appearance he maintained wasn't a disguise, but simply his preference. Thomas had grown up working the land, and despite his wealth, he found comfort in the familiar textures of well-worn jeans and faded shirts rather than expensive suits. His straw hat, a constant companion for decades, had sheltered him through years of outdoor labor before he ever set foot in a boardroom. His wallet, clutched tightly in his work-hardened hands, contained not only his identification, but also the keycard that would grant him access to any part of the building, a fact that would have shocked Victor and the others had they known. The leather was cracked and worn, much like its owner, but what it held represented power beyond anything the young manager could imagine. Thomas observed everything with quiet attention: the impatient customers, the dismissive staff, the way Victor carried himself with unearned superiority. Each interaction was mentally catalogued, each judgment noted. He could have revealed himself at any moment, could have watched Victor's smug expression crumble with a single word. But that wasn't his way. The elderly man believed that character revealed itself most honestly when people thought no one of consequence was watching. And in this moment, as he stood absorbing Victor's mockery, he was learning everything he needed to know about the culture that had developed within his bank. A culture that had clearly strayed from the values of respect and service he had worked so hard to instill. "Next customer, please," the clerk called out, his lips still curled in amusement from Victor Morrow's earlier remark. His eyes darted to his colleagues, sharing in the collective joke at the old man's expense. Mr. Harlan stepped forward with unhurried dignity, his weathered hands gripping the worn leather wallet that had accompanied him through decades of life. The marble floor seemed to amplify each of his measured footsteps as he approached the counter, drawing even more attention from the impatient customers behind him. "How may I help you today?" the clerk asked, his tone carrying a barely concealed condescension. His name tag read Thomas, and he wore the same crisp uniform as the other bank employees, though his tie hung slightly askew. "I'd like to check my account balance, please," the elderly man replied softly, his voice steady despite the lingering echo of Victor's mockery still hanging in the air. Thomas smirked. "Certainly. I'll need to see some identification." With careful movements, Mr. Dewborn, Harlan opened his wallet and extracted his ID card. The plastic was slightly worn at the edges from years of use, but the information remained clear. He slid it across the polished counter surface. The clerk took the identification with 2 fingers, as if reluctant to touch something that belonged to someone dressed so plainly. He glanced at the photo, then at the old man, confirming the match with barely disguised disinterest. "Account number?" Thomas asked, fingers poised over his keyboard. "It should be linked to my identification," Mr. Harlan replied. Several customers behind him sighed audibly, checking their watches and smartphones. A woman in a tailored business suit rolled her eyes at the person beside her, making no attempt to hide her impatience with the elderly customer who seemed to be holding up the line. Thomas entered the information into the system with exaggerated keystrokes, occasionally glancing toward Victor's office as if hoping the branch manager was watching him handle this supposedly difficult customer. "One moment while I access your information," the clerk announced loudly, as though performing for the audience of well-dressed patrons. Harlan stood quietly, his posture straight despite his years. His eyes, wise and patient, watched the clerk's face without resentment or anger. He had weathered far worse than the petty judgment of strangers throughout his long life. The straw hat in his hand caught a beam of sunlight streaming through the bank's windows, creating a gentle halo effect that went unnoticed by everyone in the lobby. Everyone was too busy judging his appearance to see the quiet dignity he carried. Thomas tapped a few more keys, waiting for the system to retrieve the account information, completely unaware that his next glance at the screen would forever change his perception of the humble man standing before him. The clerk's smirk evaporated the instant his eyes met the screen. Where he had expected to find a meager sum, perhaps a few $100s at most, he instead saw a string of digits that made his mouth go dry. The balance in Mr. Harlan's account contained more zeros than the clerk had ever seen attached to a single name. Is there a problem?" the elderly man asked softly, his weathered hands resting calmly on the counter. The clerk couldn't speak. His fingers, suddenly clumsy with shock, hovered over the keyboard as he double-checked the figure, certain there must be some error. But there was no mistake. The humble man standing before him in faded clothes possessed a fortune that dwarfed the combined wealth of everyone else in the lobby. "No, sir," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "No problem at all." The young employee's hands began to tremble as the full reality sank in. This unassuming customer, whom he had mentally dismissed as soon as he'd shuffled through the door, could purchase the entire building they stood in, several times over. The bank itself was merely a small portion of the wealth Mr. Harlan commanded. Behind the counter, Another teller noticed her colleague's strange behavior and glanced over his shoulder. Her sharp intake of breath drew attention from nearby staff. Like dominoes falling, awareness began to spread through the employee area. Something extraordinary was happening. The clerk printed the balance slip with trembling fingers, the paper seeming to weigh 1,000 pounds as the machine spat it out. He folded it carefully, almost reverently, before sliding it across the counter. "Your balance statement, sir," he said, his earlier condescension replaced with a deference he hadn't known he possessed. Mr. Harlan nodded, seemingly unaffected by the clerk's dramatic change in demeanor. The elderly man reached for the slip with calloused fingers, hands that had clearly known decades of physical labor, despite commanding resources that could have spared him any work at all. The clerk couldn't help but stare at those hands. How many people had judged their owner, just as he had done minutes ago? How many had seen the straw hat and torn jeans and decided they knew everything worth knowing about the man? "Will there be anything else today?" the clerk asked, his voice now pitched low with respect. The old man shook his head, tucking the statement into his leather wallet, with the same care he might give to a $5 bill. "That's all I needed, thank you." In that moment, the clerk understood with perfect clarity that the numbers on the screen revealed only a fraction of the wealth the man before him possessed. The true fortune was in his dignity, something no balance could quantify. Victor Morrow sensed something was wrong. The clerk's face had gone pale, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the computer screen. Curious and still riding the high of his public mockery, Victor abandoned his conversation with the loan officer and strode confidently across the marble floor. "What's the matter? Did our farmer friend forget his account number?" Victor called out, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the lobby, though they died quickly as people noticed the clerk's expression. "Sir, I don't think," the clerk began, but Victor was already reaching over the counter. "Let me see that," he said, snatching the freshly printed balance slip from the young man's hands. The branch manager's smile remained frozen on his face for precisely 3 seconds before reality crashed down upon him. The numbers before him couldn't be right. Victor blinked hard, certain he was misreading the digits. But no, the balance showed a sum so vast it made his annual salary look like pocket change. His eyes darted to the name on the slip, Mr. Harlan. This can't be correct," he muttered, his voice suddenly small in the cavernous lobby. The elderly man stood quietly, weathered hands folded patiently before him. "Is there a problem with my account?" Mr. Harlan asked, his tone gentle but firm. Victor's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for water. The slip in his hand suddenly felt hot, burning with the evidence of his catastrophic misjudgment. His earlier words, "I'll pay you double," echoed mockingly in his mind. "No, sir," Victor finally managed, his voice cracking. "No problem at all." The branch manager's arrogance evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. His shoulders, previously squared with confidence, now slumped visibly. The pristine dark blue suit he'd been so proud of this morning suddenly felt like a costume, a pathetic attempt to project importance. Looking up, Victor realized everyone was watching. The wealthy clients in designer clothes, the staff behind their counters, even the security guard by the door. All eyes were fixed on this moment of humiliation. The very audience he'd played 2 minutes ago was now witness to his downfall. Mr. Harlan reached out one calloused hand for the balance slip. Victor relinquished it without a word, unable to meet the older man's eyes. As their fingers briefly touched during the exchange, Victor felt the rough texture of decades of honest work, something his soft, manicured hands knew nothing about. In that moment, the branch manager understood with crushing clarity that the numbers on that slip represented more than money. They represented a lifetime of wisdom he had foolishly dismissed because it came wrapped in faded denim and a straw hat. The atmosphere in the bank transformed in an instant. The hushed conversations and keyboard clicks that had filled the space seconds ago vanished, replaced by a silence so complete you could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Victor Morrow stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, the balance slip trembling between his fingers as the color drained from his face. His perfectly knotted red tie suddenly felt like a noose around his neck. Every pair of eyes in the lobby had shifted. No longer was Mr. Harlan the object of scrutiny and silent mockery. Now all attention focused on the young manager whose arrogance had just collided spectacularly with reality. The customers in their business attire, who moments ago had been checking their watches impatiently, now found themselves riveted to this unexpected drama unfolding before them. "Is everything in order?" Mr. Harlan asked quietly, his weathered hand extended toward the slip of paper. Victor couldn't speak. His throat had constricted, and beads of sweat formed along his hairline despite the cool air. With mechanical movements, he surrendered the document, unable to meet the elderly man's gaze. Mr. Harlan took the balance slip with the same calm dignity with which he'd endured the earlier humiliation. His calloused fingers folded the paper precisely, once, twice, before tucking it into his old leather wallet. Not a flicker of triumph or vindication crossed his features. He simply nodded, as if concluding a routine transaction. A woman in a tailored suit who had been smirking earlier now studied her shoes intently. The security guard by the door straightened his posture unconsciously. The teller, who had been whispering and giggling with her colleague, now looked mortified, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. The branch manager's earlier words, "If you even have a balance, old man, I'll pay you double," seemed to hang in the air, a cruel echo that everyone could still hear. Victor's promise, made in jest to elevate himself by diminishing another, now threatened financial ruin, even the fortune reflected in those numbers. Mr. Harlan adjusted his straw hat slightly, his movements unhurried. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught the silver of his beard, giving him an almost ethereal quality against the bank's polished surfaces. He stood there, not as a defeated old man in worn jeans and a faded checkered shirt, but as someone whose worth transcended the superficial judgments that had been cast upon him. The lobby remained suspended in that moment, a tableau of shocked faces, averted gazes, and one dignified old man whose quiet presence now commanded the room without a single word being spoken. The silence in the bank lobby was deafening. Mr. Harlan stood there, the folded balance slip now tucked safely in his old leather wallet, his weathered hands closing it with practiced care. The shock on Victor Morrow's face had transformed his usual confident demeanor into something unrecognizable, a man suddenly aware of his terrible mistake. The real balance we carry isn't in a bank account, but in how we treat others, Mr. Harlan said, his voice neither angry nor triumphant, but measured and clear enough that everyone in the hushed lobby could hear. His words hung in the air, weighty with wisdom earned through decades of life. The elderly man adjusted his straw hat slightly, his eyes meeting Victor's with neither malice nor pleasure at the younger man's discomfort. "I've found, Mr. Morrow, that kindness costs nothing but yields the greatest returns." The branch manager stood frozen, the printed slip still clutched in his trembling fingers. "You see," Mr. Harlan continued, addressing not just Victor, but everyone listening, "I started with nothing but my 2 hands and a willingness to work. This bank wasn't built on mockery or judgment, but on helping people believe in themselves when no one else would." A woman in a business suit who had been impatiently checking her device earlier now looked up, her expression softened. An older gentleman in line nodded slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "When I founded this institution," Mr. Harlan said, his voice gaining strength without losing its gentleness, "I made a promise that everyone who walked through those doors would be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance or the size of their accounts." Victor swallowed hard. his tie suddenly feeling too tight around his neck. The young manager's face had flushed crimson, sweat beading at his temples. "I don't need your money, son," the elderly CEO continued, referring to Victor's earlier boast. "But perhaps today can be valuable in a different way." He gestured around the lobby. "We're all just people trying to make our way. The numbers in our accounts rise and fall, but how we make others feel, that's the true currency of life." Several customers nodded in agreement. A teller wiped discreetly at her eyes. "I hope you'll remember that," Mr. Harlan finished, his calloused hand now resting on his wallet, "because at the end of our days, no one remembers our balance sheets. They remember how we balanced our humanity." With that, he turned slightly, ready to continue his business elsewhere in the bank, leaving Victor standing there, the paper in his hand now feeling as heavy as the lesson he'd just received. Mr. Harlan tucked his worn leather wallet into his pocket and turned toward the exit. His weathered boots made a soft, rhythmic sound against the marble floor as he walked away from the counter. Each deliberate step carried the weight of dignity that no amount of mockery could diminish. The elderly man moved unhurriedly, his back straight despite his years, the straw hat held loosely in one calloused hand. The bank lobby remained frozen in a tableau of shock. Not a phone buzzed, not a pen scratched. The silence was absolute, broken only by the steady cadence of Mr. Harlan's footsteps. Victor Morrow stood rooted to the spot, the balance slip still clutched in his trembling hand. The young manager's face had drained of all color, leaving him ashen beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. His perfect suit suddenly felt too tight, his carefully knotted tie a noose. Every gleaming surface in the bank, the polished counters, the spotless windows, the shining floor, seemed to reflect his shame back at him from all directions. A woman in a business suit stepped aside as the elderly man passed, her eyes now filled with respect rather than the dismissal she had shown minutes earlier. A security guard who had barely acknowledged Mr. Harlan's entrance now stood at attention, offering a small nod of deference. The branch manager felt every pair of eyes in the room shift from the departing figure to himself. Customers who had previously smiled at his cruel joke now regarded him with undisguised contempt. His staff averted their gazes, suddenly fascinated by their computer screens or paperwork. Mr. Harlan's shadow stretched long across the floor as he approached the glass doors. The morning sunlight caught the silver in his beard, creating a momentary halo effect that wasn't lost on those watching. The owner of the bank pushed the door open with one hand, the same hand that had built this institution from nothing. Behind him, Victor swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. The manager's carefully constructed world of appearances was crumbling around him. He had built his career on impressing others, on the sharp cut of his suit and the firmness of his handshake. Now, in the wake of true dignity, his shallow foundations were exposed. As the door began to swing closed behind Mr. Harlan, Victor took an instinctive step forward, though whether to follow, to apologize, or simply to escape the suffocating atmosphere, even he couldn't say. The sound of his expensive shoe on the marble echoed inappropriately loud in the silent lobby, drawing every eye back to him once more. Just before reaching the glass doors, Mr. Harlan stopped. His weathered hand rested on the polished brass handle as he turned to face the room. The silence was absolute. Not a phone buzzed, not a paper rustled. Every eye was fixed on the elderly man who stood with unexpected authority despite his humble appearance. "I was born with nothing," he began, his voice warm and resonant, carrying easily across the marble floor. "My father was a farmer who lost everything in the drought of '53. The straw hat came off as he spoke, held respectfully against his chest. The gesture transformed him. No longer just an old man in worn clothes, but someone with a story worth hearing. I started working when I was 12, digging ditches and laying pipe. His calloused hands spoke volumes about those years. By 20, I had saved enough for my first investment, a small plot of land nobody wanted. Victor remained frozen by the counter, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like a costume rather than clothing. That land, the elderly gentleman continued, had oil beneath it. Not much, but enough to start this bank 47 years ago. A collective gasp rippled through the lobby. The customers who had been so dismissive now leaned forward, hanging on every word. I founded this institution not to create wealth for myself, but to offer hope to people who needed someone to believe in them. He gestured around the space. These marble floors and glass walls are impressive, but they mean nothing if the people inside forget why we're here. A young mother in the corner wiped away a tear. An older businessman nodded solemnly. I still wear these clothes, Mr. Harlan said, plucking at his faded, checkered shirt, because they remind me of who I am and where I came from. The moment we believe our worth comes from what we wear or how others see us, we've already lost something precious. His gaze settled briefly on the branch manager, not with anger, but with something closer to compassion. This bank was built on respect for every person who walks through that door, regardless of what they're wearing or how much money they have. The owner's voice grew softer, forcing everyone to listen more carefully. When we forget that, we're no longer a bank worth having in this community. With those words hanging in the air, he placed his straw hat back on his head and turned toward the exit, leaving behind a room full of people profoundly changed by what they had witnessed. A profound silence hung in the air as Mr. Harlan's words resonated through the marble-floored lobby. The wisdom in his voice had transformed the space from a mere financial institution into something akin to a sanctuary of reflection. Every person present seemed to be processing his message in their own way, their expression shifting from shock to contemplation. A young mother in the corner, who had been impatiently bouncing her toddler on her hip while waiting for her turn, now stood perfectly still. Tears welled in her eyes and traced silent paths down her cheeks. She pulled her child closer, as if suddenly reminded of values she wanted to instill in the next generation. "That's what my father always said," whispered an elderly gentleman in a tailored suit to his companion. He pressed his weathered hand against his chest, his eyes distant with memory. "Work hard, stay humble, help others." I'd almost forgotten. The tellers behind their counters exchanged glances of discomfort and revelation. One of them quietly closed the drawer she had been counting currency in, her movements deliberate, as if handling something newly precious. Another removed his name badge and polished it thoughtfully, perhaps seeing it as a symbol of service rather than status for the first time. Even the security guard, who had been watching Mr. Harlan with suspicion when he first entered, now stood at attention with newfound respect. His posture had changed from vigilance to reverence. A businessman who had been loudly complaining about wait times just minutes earlier now sat silently, his smartphone forgotten in his hand. He stared at his expensive watch, then slowly slipped it under his cuff, as if suddenly conscious of its ostentatious display. The shift was palpable, like a wave of self-awareness washing over everyone present. Conversations that resumed did so in hushed, thoughtful tones. A few people stepped out of line to allow others ahead of them. A woman offered her seat to an elderly gentleman who had been standing. For a brief moment, the usual barriers of social status and wealth that typically divided the bank's clientele seemed to dissolve. The space between the marble floors and the vaulted ceiling held not just people conducting transactions, but human beings confronting their values. In that suspended moment, Mr. Harlan had accomplished something remarkable. Without wealth displays or power plays, the elderly man had reminded everyone present of something they had known but forgotten. that character outlasts currency, and dignity outweighs dollars. The revelation hung in the air like invisible gold, more valuable than anything stored in the bank's vaults. Victor Morrow stood rooted to the marble floor, his expensive leather shoes suddenly feeling like concrete blocks. The air conditioning that had kept the bank pleasantly cool all morning now felt like an Arctic blast against his burning cheeks. His colleagues and the customers, people who had witnessed his mockery just minutes ago, were now watching him with expressions ranging from pity to disgust. The branch manager's mind raced through the events of the past 15 minutes, replaying his own cruel words. "If you even have a balance, old man, I'll pay you double." The phrase now echoed in his head with a different tone, not the confident sneer he had delivered it with, but as a damning testimony to his character. Victor loosened his red tie slightly, feeling it choking him as the reality of his situation sank in. This wasn't just any elderly man he had humiliated. This was Mr. Harlan, the owner of the entire banking institution, the man whose signature appeared on his paychecks. "Sir, he started to say, but the words died in his throat as Mr. Harlan turned away, clearly uninterested in his belated apology. For the first time in his career, the young manager felt truly small. His expensive suit, which he had chosen so carefully that morning, now felt like a costume, a shallow attempt to project importance he hadn't earned. The dark blue fabric that had given him such confidence hours earlier now seemed to hang heavily on his shoulders, weighing him down with shame. A wealthy customer, who had laughed at Victor's joke earlier, now averted her eyes, suddenly fascinated by her smartphone. Another patron, a business executive who had often shared knowing glances with Victor about certain clientele, now stared at him with undisguised contempt. Victor's mind flashed back to other moments, the times he had rushed elderly customers through their transactions, the impatience he had shown to those who didn't fit his image of success, the way he had cultivated a culture of judgment among his staff. Each memory was another crack in the facade he had built around himself. His fingers trembled slightly as he straightened his tie again, a nervous habit that betrayed his inner turmoil. The branch manager, who had always prided himself on control, now felt utterly exposed. In the silence that followed Mr. Harlan's departure, Victor realized something profound. His entire sense of self-worth had been built on appearances and the diminishment of others. Without those props, who was he? The question terrified him more than the inevitable meeting with corporate that would surely follow. As he finally managed to move his feet, walking back toward his glass office, Victor knew that regardless of whether he kept his position, something fundamental had changed. The emptiness of his arrogance had been laid bare, not just to everyone in the bank, but finally, painfully, to himself. The bank remained eerily silent for several minutes after Mr. Harlan departed. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to spotlight the empty space where he had stood, his dignified exit more powerful than any dramatic storming out could have been. Customers who had witnessed the exchange stood frozen, documents clutched in their hands, while others who had missed it sensed the tension and whispered questions to those nearby. By noon, the story had traveled from teller to teller. "Did you hear what happened with Victor and the owner?" One whispered during a quick break. The clerk who had processed Mr. Harlan's request couldn't stop his hands from trembling even hours later. He described the balance he'd seen to his colleagues with wide eyes, voice hushed as if speaking of something sacred. Victor remained in his glass office, blinds drawn, a rare sight in itself. Through the slits, staff could see him sitting motionless at his desk, tie loosened, staring at nothing in particular. The young manager, normally so quick to patrol the floor and critique staff appearances, hadn't emerged since the incident. "He owns the entire bank," a teller told a customer who'd arrived late, her voice dropping to a reverent whisper. Came in dressed like he was straight from the fields, and Victor humiliated him in front of everyone. By mid-afternoon, customers who hadn't even been present were returning, inventing reasons to visit the bank. A forgotten signature, a minor query, their curious eyes scanning the lobby for any remnants of the morning's drama. The story grew with each retelling. The exact amount in Mr. Harlan's account increased. The elderly man's response became more eloquent. Victor's shame more profound. A security guard who had worked at the bank for 15 years stood near the entrance, nodding knowingly when asked about the elderly gentleman. "Seen him maybe 4 times in all my years here," he confirmed. "Always in those same worn clothes. Never suspected a thing." The bank's atmosphere had transformed. Staff who normally avoided eye contact with shabbily dressed customers now greeted everyone with careful respect. The wealthy clients who had smirked alongside Victor that morning now appeared subdued, examining their own behavior in the harsh light of the day's events. As closing time approached, a memo arrived from corporate headquarters. The branch would close early tomorrow for an all-staff meeting. No explanation was provided, but everyone knew. The whispers continued as they locked drawers and shut down systems. "What do you think will happen to Victor?" a young teller asked her supervisor. The older woman glanced toward the still darkened office. "I don't know," she replied quietly, "but I don't think any of us will forget today's lesson." Word of the incident spread like wildfire through the bank's branches. By Wednesday morning, the corporate office had received multiple reports about Victor Morrow's public humiliation of an elderly customer, who turned out to be none other than the bank's founder and majority owner. Victor received the call at 9:35. The board wanted to see him immediately. His stomach twisted into knots as he straightened his tie in the elevator mirror, rehearsing excuses that sounded hollow even to his own ears. The corporate tower loomed over the city, its glass exterior reflecting clouds that seemed to move faster than normal. When the young manager entered the boardroom, 12 solemn faces turned toward him. At the head of the mahogany table sat Mr. Harlan. Gone was the straw hat and faded clothing. Today, he wore a simple gray suit, not flashy, but impeccably tailored. His weathered hands rested calmly on the polished surface, his wallet placed deliberately beside them. "Please, sit down," Mr. Harlan said, gesturing to the empty chair directly across from him. Victor lowered himself slowly, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. The elderly man didn't raise his voice or make a scene. He simply recounted the events as they had happened, his dignified tone making the story all the more damning. "I founded this institution 47 years ago," Mr. Harlan explained to the board, though his eyes remained on Victor. "Not to create wealth for myself, but to build a place where people could be treated with dignity, regardless of the numbers in their account." One board member slid a resignation letter toward Victor. The paper seemed to burn beneath his fingertips. "I don't want your resignation," Mr. Harlan said, surprising everyone. "What would that teach you? Running away from shame builds nothing." The owner stood up, walking slowly around the table. "Leadership isn't measured by the cut of your suit or the shine of your shoes. It's measured by how you treat those you believe can do nothing for you." Victor's eyes welled with tears as Mr. Harlan placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have 2 choices now," the elderly man continued. "Leave and repeat your mistakes elsewhere, or stay and learn what true wealth looks like." The board members exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. "Banking isn't just about currency," Mr. Harlan concluded. "It's about trust, and trust begins with respect." As the meeting adjourned, Victor remained seated, the weight of the lesson settling on him like the heaviest of burdens, and perhaps the most valuable gift he'd ever received. The morning after the board meeting, Victor Morrow cleared his desk. His hands trembled as he placed his nameplate into a cardboard box, the weight of his actions still pressing heavily on his conscience. He couldn't bear to meet the eyes of his colleagues as he walked through the lobby one final time, the ghost of his cruel laughter still echoing in his memory. Word of what happened spread quickly throughout the financial district. The tale of the humble man in the straw hat and the arrogant manager became the subject of hushed conversations in break rooms and executive suites alike. Some dismissed it as urban legend, but those who had witnessed it firsthand knew better. In the weeks that followed, a subtle transformation took place within the bank's walls. Tellers greeted each customer with genuine warmth, regardless of their appearance. The security guard held doors open with a smile rather than a perfunctory nod. Even the most impatient customers seemed to pause and reflect before snapping at staff. Mr. Harlan rarely visited the branch after that day, preferring to conduct his business from his modest farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Yet his presence remained, almost tangible, in the changed atmosphere of the institution he had built from nothing. 6 months later, the bank unveiled a new customer service policy. Framed prominently in the lobby was a simple statement: "True wealth is measured in dignity and character." Below it, without fanfare or explanation, hung a weathered straw hat. New employees were told the story during orientation. "Judge no one by their appearance," trainers would say, "for you never know who might be standing before you." The lesson wasn't just about avoiding embarrassment. It was about recognizing the inherent worth in every person who walked through those doors. Perhaps most profoundly affected was a young loan officer who had witnessed the entire exchange. She began a program offering financial literacy courses to the community, especially targeting those who felt intimidated by banking institutions. "Everyone deserves respect when managing their money," she would say, "whether they have $10 or 10 million. As for Victor, he found work eventually at a small credit union 3 towns over. People who knew him remarked on his changed demeanor: humbler, kinder, more patient. When asked about his transformation, he would simply say he had once received an invaluable lesson from a man in a straw hat. And so, Mr. Harlan's legacy endured, not in marble monuments or named buildings, but in something far more lasting: a culture of respect that rippled outward, touching lives in ways that no balance sheet could ever measure.